Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're tuning in from. It's a pleasure to see such a nice turnout here today for our clinic on Adolphus Hailstork's Three Smiles for Tracey. I wanted to go ahead and share some information about the composer and some resources before we get into participatory guided practice. So I'm going to go ahead and share this presentation. Also, thank you to Jessica Harry for setting everything up with the Zoom session, and to Jenny McClay for helping push it out on social media. These are ICA staff, and they help keep things running beautifully. They're just wonderful, so I have to acknowledge them for their work. So, all right, Adolphus Hailstork celebrated his 80th birthday last year. Some keynotes about him. He's a professor of music, and he's an eminent scholar at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. You could find out more detailed information about his biography at his professional website, which is listed there. It's clickable. We can get this up and distributed to registrants later as a resource for the future. We were able to feature him as the Composer of the Month in April 2021. His music is widely recorded and performed by prestigious orchestras. New York Philharmonic, the Philadelphia Orchestra are just a few. He's just a really wonderful, accomplished composer. In my review of recordings, I could not find a commercially available one. So I found a couple nice recordings on YouTube that are complete, all three movements. There's a couple more out there, but these are really nice ones. Anthony McGill, of course, just an amazing player. New York Philharmonic. That one was a production at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, so the production quality is particularly exceptional. Excellent performances also by Zachary Stump, assistant principal clarinet, Omaha Symphony, and Catherine Better, who New York freelance performer and teacher at Mannes Prep at the New School as well. Those are a couple resources that may be helpful to you. All right. First note, movement one, a couple fingering suggestions that you may like that will help you and the circumstances. Actually, want to share that again. First one we see here. This one might be a little bit controversial, but if you are a fan of the Peter Hadcock book, The Working Clarinetist, he mentions a way of doing this by sticking a reed in the Daphnis and Chloe excerpts to keep the D flat lever depressed as you play this. So you could actually do that in this passage everywhere that it occurs in measures 1 and 2, all the way through the last D flat that occurs there. Then measures 7 and 8, another place that we could do that, and then 37 and 38. Some might find the little bit of intonation weirdness too distracting, but I just mentioned that as a possibility. Note in movement 1, in the second measure, there is what I believe to be a typographical error or an errata. I do not think that is a C. If you look, the 8th note is a clarion C. I think that's a D flat, which tracks with every other measure. So I wanted to point that out. In this movement, I encourage you not to be afraid of exaggeration. There's a lot of retards and accelerandos written throughout. I think that they could be really declamatory if we pull back a great deal to start and then push through. I think that's an important stylistic feature. And I personally think that 160 is probably a little bit too zippy for those 16th notes that occur in measures 13 and measures 43, 44, places like that. Some other fingering suggestions, especially with young clarinetists, I find that they learn this one because it tracks with what they might learn first in the low register and the clarion register for F sharp. So I just want to reinforce that this fingering for E flat is preferable in every circumstance where it occurs in this movement, such as measures 24, 25, 26, places like that. That one's far better for intonation. There's a couple places that we have a change in register that occurs between the clarion and the altissimo register. Measures 6, measure 36 are such places. We might like to use a half hole for D flat to help smooth the transition between the clarion and the altissimo register. I like to reserve that particular technique for slower moving things. There are certainly other transitions between the altissimo and the clarion register that occur throughout, but those are the couple places that I would suggest considering that. Also, note in measure 19, we have a lot of F sharp surrounding E sharp, so certainly want to be using this fingering for F sharp. That's very important to point out to your students, and other places that occurs, such as 21 and 22. This particular movement really benefits from using alternate rhythms. So I like to go through it phrase by phrase like this. So I would practice measures 1 through 5 using each of these rhythms. And if you have your clarinet, go ahead and join me. I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm actually getting ready for a concert next week on Thursday, so I've been doing a lot of this kind of stuff, so I thought I'd just kind of guide us through my process. So if you're already muted, I won't mute myself, but so this is the first line. Following that, I'll go on to the next, of course. And last but not least, and I find this one quite tricky, the syncopated one, but also really, really beneficial. After playing each of these rhythms, I'm feeling really well programmed with my fingers. Like my muscle memory is feeling pretty nice and good. That's a working tempo. It works really nicely, this technique, with a metronome as well. If you're trying to build speed, you might start at a slow tempo that works well for you, or a moderate tempo, and then push yourself up to your goal. After getting through that first phrase, I'm going to move on to measure 7, and I'm actually going to go through the same process. It's really efficient in this movement because this material repeats itself later. We don't have to do every phrase this way because you've practiced it once. You should be in good shape. So let's go ahead and do measure 7. We'll go through all 3 rhythms. Moving ahead, I would also recommend that you look at this. Measure 17 would be the next spot. We could do this one in smaller fragments. It's not quite as continuous. So I use the eighth rests as my guide, if you will. So, and I just start on the first high note of measure 17. The next spot I find this very, very, very helpful is I'm going to skip ahead to measure 31. This is the same material, of course, as we find in the opening, however, in our low register. I find the fingerings here a little more awkward, and then it goes on a little tour later in terms of where it goes with the pitches, but I also think it's important to point out to your students that in measure 34, unless they have some sort of super clarinet, we need to start that sequence of little fingers on the left hand. In the preceding measure, we might try both of those sequences starting on the right hand. This is rhythm 2. Now let's all do rhythm 3. The next stream of eighth notes is, of course, repeated from measure 7 through 12. So I'm already feeling pretty well practiced about that. In regard to the staccato passages, I suggest we first start looking at these in tempo before we push and pull. I think that's very important whenever you're dealing with rubato, to have that sort of rhythmic framework worked out before you push and pull. Good for your muscle memory too, of course. This passage also may benefit from playing through legato before you deal with adding the tongue, just to make sure your finger coordination's excellent before you add in articulation. This applies, of course, at measure 13 and at measure 43. I do measure 43 at just a steady tempo first and without articulation before adding in the tongue. Next, I add the tongue, still steady. I suppose I should have actually articulated those, huh? Now, last but not least, I'll actually detach the eighth notes. That makes sure I've got lots of good wind behind it before I try to separate. I notice that's an issue so often with articulation in developing players, and even more advanced players. It's something we always work on, is making sure that our wind's really behind our tongue. Now I've done it a few times in tempo, now we could push pull and play with time a little bit more, as an example. And that's the way that I like to approach those particular things. Uh, Again, 160, maybe too zippy. If you can do it and with lots of character, I think that's great. But I think the character is more important than the speed. But if you can do both, awesome. Most important, make it convincing. And pardon, I didn't share a score or anything because of copyright concerns. So I was hoping everybody had their own copy. I only have one fingering suggestion for the second movement. And I think you might consider using a half-hole technique to approach altissimo D in measures 11 and measure 15. Those are the two places I think that's highly beneficial. We could consider using it maybe in measure 26, but perhaps measure 33. But I think the places where we have a quarter note in particular, those wider leaps, it's very, very helpful. Hailstork notates this movement at eighth note equals 144. Once you feel really confident in the rhythmic framework around the eighth note, I think we should think in one though. To feel that nice sense of a gentle waltz, which is how I perceive this music. It has a waltzy kind of lilt to it. I also think that thinking in one is very, very helpful with making organic rubato. There's a lot of retards and accelerandos written in here with indications of where an a tempo should take place. And I think the idea is he's just kind of guiding you through tasteful rubato. Another technical point, particularly helpful for young students, and I find this really helpful myself, when approaching the wider intervals, it's very important that my upper lip is firm to get that nice downward press into the mouthpiece, and countering that with upward pressure from the right thumb. Things that we should always do, but here I think it's doubly important. This helps stabilize the instrument and, of course, enables the reed to vibrate freely, doing its job, and that enables us to get nice, smooth connections in these leaps. I encourage everyone to really exaggerate the dynamics here and treat each unit between rests as something a little bit separate. So, for example, the first 4 bars. That was the first 6 bars, but as an example, lots of push and pull make a big difference between mezzo forte and piano. It is tempting at the odd tempos to ease back into the tempo, but I think that with all of the push and pull, I like to treat these odd tempos as immediate. So that would sound something like this from measure 5. That's my personal way of going about it. Next spot, the sforzandos in measures 20, 21, 22, and 23. We've got 4 of those in a row. The first 3 are, of course, on the last 16th note, and then the final one is on the second 16th note. I like to think of each of these as a little bit more than the preceding one. So from measure 19. That gives it a little bit more shape over the course of this phrase. At the end, a really big retard is great. before the odd tempo. And I find it helpful for this diminuendo to start a little bit later than Hailstork indicates. He puts it right after the forte. I wait for like maybe the last three notes to get this kind of evaporate into the ether effect. Something like that. Those are just some ideas. All right. Movement 3's technical demands are pretty modest, but it's a nice movement. Now the third movement marks sprightly. I again like to do this one phrase by phrase, and because there's so many little rhythmic tricks in this particular movement, I am a big fan of say it before you play it. So what that means is I'm gonna clap the quarter pulse. So like 1 up, 1 up, and throughout that. And I want to do that to make sure that I really see 100% where things are occurring rhythmically within the bar. I also think that we can say with contouring. So, for example, we have streams of 16th notes in measures 4 and 5. We can shape up and down as we say it. So 1 up and E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 E and things like that. I do believe if you say it with inflection, you will then play it that way. And this is great to make your young students uncomfortable, but they need to get comfortable with their musical ideas and projecting them through the instrument. The earlier that we're doing this, the better. We communicate through the clarinet. And that's just one way of doing it. I really like to make the most of all of these retards. A couple technical points about fingering that I think are really important and helpful with this movement, mostly towards the end. At measures 35 and 36, altissimo G flat. This is basically the regular fingering that we mark in that we see in a lot of textbooks, but it's missing an important aspect. This fingering, more often than not, we need to use this sliver key. That has two great benefits. One of them is it raises a flat note up to in tune, roughly. The second benefit, it simply responds better this way. So if given a choice, I'm going to use that fingering for G flat. And I think this is a good place. There are other options, of course, but this is my personal favorite. For the altissimo G that occur in measure 36 and 39, I really like to use this fingering. I think it tunes beautifully on most instruments. It responds really nicely in the circumstances, and it works with the fingerings that surround it. Again, altissimo E flat. Remind your students, use this, never this. This, never this. This. I actually tell my students, you can use this fingering when I tell you. And I even think there's a better trill fingering than that one, personally. Let's look through a few of these thorny streams of notes that occur. I particularly note that measures 8 and 9, 12 and 13, and later 28 and 29. These are particularly thorny. They're tricky passages. So I like to isolate these particular measures in my practice. A lot of the other measures are just not that difficult to play. So I like to isolate this first First, all under a nice big slur, just to make sure I'm very smooth and even with my fingers. Why don't we go ahead and do that together at your working tempo. Next, I'll add the tongue if I'm feeling good about my legato approach. Last but not least, you'll note that I really like to add one layer at a time. It reminds me of each of these things. Now I really want to exaggerate each of those accents that Hailstork has written. That gives it kind of a quasi-jazzy sort of bluesy effect because they're irregular, right? First one's on a downbeat, the second one's on the 4th 16th note, and the next one doesn't occur until the next downbeat. So I think that's important. Also, preceding measures, measures 7 and 8, it occurs on the ah with a tie. So these are spicy. It's really important for the style, I think. Tricky rhythms that occur throughout. Places like measure 9 and measures 13 through 17, measures 19 through 23. There's all this syncopated stuff with all these crazy ties. As we know, ties are sort of the trickiest thing to depart right on time. My suggestion with these sorts of things is to practice them with the subdivisions. So if you look at measures 13, we would just play streams of 16th notes to get the basic layout. I know that's a very popular practice technique, but I think it's certainly applicable here. Once I'm feeling good about subdivision, one thing at a time, I'll tie everything back together except for the ties that obscure the beat, because that's where I find most of the trouble occurs. Like in measure 13, that E flat's tied from beat 3 to beat 4. So leave it out a few times until you are 100% confident in your rhythm. The other stylistic trick, I think, is to make sure that our ties aren't too sustained, because that would cause us to get behind. Also, this is sprightly, so we don't want a sostenuto approach. Make a big deal about the fortes that appear throughout here, and of course the accents that go along with them. This is from the end of measure 13. All the syncopated passages really benefit from this type of treatment. If we look at the 5/8 measures that occur between measures 30 and 34, although it is certainly beneficial to work through this with the metronome set on the 8th note, it doesn't have the right character. I call them lines and triangles. We want to make the triangles a little bit fatter than the lines, so it might be a little bit more time than is mathematically correct. So I definitely like to either clap or conduct here. Conducting's really nice. I think that's the best way to practice it before adding the instrument into the equation. You may also find it really helpful to leave out the ties. And then add them back in. To conclude this, Hailstork puts a bunch of crazy notes and changing note values. So I think it's important to go through it with a metronome moderately just to get the outlay of the time. perfect when we're going from 16ths to 16th triplets to 8th triplets, then to 30 seconds in the ascending gesture and all that. I think it's supposed to be pretty crazy, but it's fun. But then I think we could be a little bit freer with it. It doesn't have to be exactly metronomic. Think of these things more gesturally, especially the arpeggios as they go up and down in measure 38. We can take a little time to start those and then catch up, if you will, accelerate through to the next eighth note. A particular technical issue that we might encounter at the end is slurring up from an open G to an altissimo E flat. And this is the way I like to practice this. It might help with your if you're working on this with a student or if you're preparing it yourself. But voicing exercises or practicing squeaking, I first would start on A flat just to get that right voicing with breath attacks. Then we can we've got the vocabulary of the voicing. Then try to play, of course, with the correct fingering for E flat. I find it so helpful, and it releases a lot of tension that some people will encounter when they see an interval like that, because we associate it with just difficulty, and it makes us tense. But this is the easy way. All right, those are all my technical points for Hailstork's 3 Smiles for Tracey. I did forget to mention earlier in the clinic that this piece was actually written for a senior music major at Old Dominion, kind of as a gift. So the composer wrote it for a student to perform on their culminating recital, and he didn't expect it to become quite as popular as it has. But I'm very grateful for the fact that we have this piece in our literature. And I think that I would love to hear your thoughts, questions, and I'll see what I can do as far as answering them. If you have a question, could you just raise your virtual hand? We have a very nice turnout today. Thank you all so much for joining us. Yes, Jack.
Yeah, I have in the second movement, first measure, second measure, there's a leap from E to D.
Yes.
Every recording I've heard, and I heard it with you too, there's a little bit of a grunt right before the D. And I'm wondering if you know any way to keep that from happening.
It is tricky. You know, that ascending interval from the Shalom register to the clarion register. And despite my best efforts in practice, yes, it still happens sometimes in performance. The way that I like to approach intervals like this is there's a couple. One of them is actually to try to trick myself into getting that image of smooth legato by leaving out the register change. So I practice it in both registers independently. And then lower. And then put it back into context and see if that helps. Let's see if it helps. Was that better? Not perfectly smooth. I think that often
it was still there
from the thumb being late. So at times it helps to isolate this and then really think of the thumb as leading. That's often the late finger that causes the grunt. And the other errant finger could be the ring finger of the right hand. Those are things to think about as you strive for better legato in leaps like that. I'll keep practicing. It's not it's on Thursday. this is one of the movements I revisit last in my process. It's least tricky. Thank you for that observation and question. And yes, please use the chat for questions. Incidentally, I learned this work last spring um, as I was looking for unaccompanied repertoire that was by underrepresented composers. So I found this particular work, and I was very pleased to see that they chose to include it on the high school competition literature for ICA this year. That's wonderful, Emily. I think we are out of questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this. Oh, uh, brand new. Great question, Alessandra. The first thing that I would do in developing a practice plan for learning this piece, or really any piece, is to sort of figure out what my point of departure is going to be. Tempo is very important. Just finding that tempo that I can comfortably play things successfully as a point of departure. I think it's really important to note what that is. And I started at least half of what he wrote when I started learning it. So he marks like the first movement at dotted quarter equals 160. These licks I started at 80, dotted quarter equals 80. I recommend that kind of approach. I'd say that he marks the third movement, quarter equals 112. 56 would be a point of departure. That's just excellent. An excellent habit for tricky technical things like this. Note where the phrases are from the beginning. You'll note that as I worked through this, I was looking at it as phrases, not the first measure to the end of any particular movement. Rather, I'm looking at smaller pieces. I think it's very important that we process music this way from the earliest stage, so that we are looking at it as not technique, but rather as phrases. So this also helps us learn things in smaller units. I think the process is quicker and less overwhelming. Your question about one movement at a time. It depends on your timeline. It depends on how much time you have. This particular work, I would be personally working a lot on movements 1 and 3 as a point of departure. And I would visit the second movement a little bit later because it's simply not as difficult. And we want to be spending the most of our time working on the things that are most challenging. So that's an important part of the plan. I also think that with something with this much rubato, it's really important to learn it in a steady way so that you have that rhythmic framework and you have that security in your muscle memory. So when you invariably might be distracted or have something that doesn't go quite the way you want it to, your muscles can help you then. I'd like to say that I am 100% focused on what I'm doing when I'm performing. but that would be a lie. I do get distracted, and then I have to practice in such a way that my body takes care of those lapses in attention. I know there are some people who are really crazy able to focus in that way. It's a challenge that I have myself is that I'm not able to do that. So I have to really work on things like this so that I basically have it memorized before I walk on stage. I don't want to be actively thinking about things like that. So once you've got the things at a nice steady tempo, then the retards and the accelerandos and those sorts of things come more organically. And you can be really creative about it in performance. That's where spontaneity can happen. But you really do have to have it, quote, as they say, under your fingers first. I like to say to my students, stay slower longer than you think you should. You know, day 2 might not be the best day to start turning the metronome up. You might need to sit on some of these passages a good bit longer than that. I understand that we can be somewhat impatient in practicing. I am impatient myself, but I really try to look at tricky things, and I don't even think about getting faster until I see the complete picture right away when I'm looking at it. You know, I'm not reading notes, so to say. I just see it and I know it, and then I know that it could be time to start working a little bit on speed. I wouldn't say that measures 1 through 6, increasing from half tempo to the performance tempo, that shouldn't happen in one day. Over the course of weeks, perhaps, depending on how much time you have. I do know there are some people out there who are just incredible technicians, and they can take something like this. And I heard this story about a French clarinetist he received a score to the timepieces by Robert Muchinsky, and he thought it was really interesting, so he performed it the next day. I'm not personally like that, but there are some people out there apparently that can do that. But this piece, I worked on it for a good month before I did some virtual performance of it. So to give you an idea of my timeline. I like that question a lot. Yes. I think it's really helpful if you're going to record for a YouTube concert. I think it's really helpful to have a nice room if you can get into one that has a little bit of resonance. I've had the privilege of working with some really amazing recording technicians, and they always say 85% of the recording is the room. So just having a nice room to record in, if that's available to you, is really, really, really helpful. It's complementing to your sound, but it just makes the overall recording quality come across much better. So if you can get into a larger space than a studio, I think that's preferable. If that's not possible, I think the other approach is that you record in a very, very dead room and add some ambiance later if you know how to do that in Audacity or something like that. If you do a Google search, you could probably find some quick tips for how to do that in Audacity. There's even presets where you can add a little bit of character. It is important, I think, to have a nice microphone rather than, just a phone microphone or a laptop microphone. I have a Blue Yeti that I bought early in the pandemic for teaching purposes. That's okay, although I understand they're thought of as a little bit noisy by audio technicians. But I think it does a pretty good job um, for a virtual concert. It's certainly better than what you'll encounter on your phone or on your laptop that's built in, if you will. I also think that phone video cameras are really nice, though. The high quality that's available on phone video cameras and iPads, I certainly think that that's something that we can use when making home recordings. But I advise you to get one of those little microphones, like that either Zoom or Shure makes, that interfaces with the Lightning port. I have one. I'll be right back. Oops, I left it at my office. But there's a number of them out there. I think like the Zoom IQ6, the Zoom IQ7. Shure makes something in that vein. There's a good number of them, and they come with like a little free app, so you can make nice audio record. Actually, in fact, I once made a audition recording in my living room using that microphone for a festival application. It was successful, so I guess it was good enough for that. But it might really that might really help with making a high quality audio or video recording for either a virtual concert or an audition. The kind of technology that's available at our fingertips now is just incredible. I just remember when I went to school, going to practice with the big old mechanical tuner and the metronome and the recording devices and all that thing, and now we just have this little thing that does all of it at our fingertips. It's pretty incredible, and the quality that we can achieve. They're making like whole entire films using only iPhones that could have fooled me. There any other questions? Oh, Alessandra. Modacity. I was mentioning Audacity. Excuse me. Audacity, which is just open source recording software, and I've recorded 2 commercially released discs, and the engineer uses that. He actually he's a Grammy award-winning engineer, and he uses the free recording software. Pretty powerful tool. There's other stuff out there, of course, but you can just download it onto your laptop. I've got it right here. There. Thank you, Jessica. And you can use like a USB mic, like a Blue Yeti. Just plug it into your laptop and make a recording. You would just have to adjust the levels, and a little bit of tinkering, some Google searches, and you're ready to go. But actually, regarding practice apps, one of my favorites that I use is called Practice Plus. It's not free, but it includes a nice metronome, a drone. I think is so important. Tuners are helpful, but the drone is more important, so that you hear the pitch and adjust to it, because that's what we actually do as musicians. We have to use our ears in this way. I really like that includes that feature, and it also has a simple recording device. So you can, and those are really the 3 big practice tools. Having a tuner, a metronome, and a recording device, and a tuner that plays pitches. Better yet than a drone on an app for free. Now on YouTube, the tuning CD is invaluable. I think that's just terrific. But I found it on a playlist on YouTube, so you could look it up. The tuning CD, and they have it at different intonations if you're, in Europe and in a country that plays at A442, or you're, working in an orchestra that plays at a higher pitch level. Not all orchestras are at A440. Some are at A441. They even indicate it in their their audition literature. Rita, I actually have not played the other works by Hailstork yet. I'm interested because I know there are a couple others that Jessica put in the chat that appeared in that interview. Um, so I'm looking forward to exploring these. A favorite practice app that I don't know if it's available, but it was called the Amazing Slow Downer. Yeah, and I liked that on many levels, and actually not just for Hailstork, but the Amazing Slow Downer. You could take like a recording. I like to use Sean Osborne's recording of the Bernstein Sonata to prepare for concerts. Um, and I like that I could loop the really difficult 5/8 measures in the second movement and play along because the metronome was not nearly as helpful as hearing the actual piano part. Also, it's a helpful pedagogical tool to be able to take a professional recording to and then put it down to half tempo because some of the things that clarinet teachers ask their students to do, like stop tonguing or clipped articulation, at slow tempos they sound gross, you know, and it's actually I think it discourages the student from learning to do it really well because you've got to do these things slow really well before you can speed them up. But I think it's helpful to listen to a professional performer play some of this literature at half tempo, and you can really actually hear the techniques that they are using, and then that kind of sells it to your students. You have to sell good teaching for some reason. I don't know why, but I needed it to be sold to me too when I was a student. And I wasn't aware about that, Jessica, so thank you. But my favorite thing about Amazing Slow Downer is the ability to save the measures so I can reference them at quick speed later. Like if something I really need to drill it, I can save that as a loop. And it just makes, practicing more efficient. I like practicing, but I've got other things to do with my time other than, research the same things over and over again. Let me see if it's still on the App Store. There's a couple apps like that have that feature. Someone introduced it to me. Oh yeah, it is on the App Store still. Um, AnyTune also has those features for being able to slow things down. That's another one. And I think they're all available on either the App Store or on your iPhone. I'm not an Android user, so I can't comment, but often there's an Android version. Some of the advanced features you do have to pay for the app, but if you pay $9.99 for something, you have it forever. I bought a couple of these maybe 8 or 9 years ago, and I'm still using them, and I don't have to pay for them again. So it's an investment. Every time I play Bernstein Sonata, I use that. Still have the measures saved, and I haven't performed that in maybe 5 years, but just have it at my fingertips. Thank you, Jack. Absolutely. I can actually share the PowerPoint and put it in the chat right away. as a PDF. That's okay. While I'm thinking about it. All right. I'm putting it in the chat for future reference. Yes, thank you, Jessica. There's a couple sessions coming up that are also from New Music Committee of ICA. We have one on double tonguing coming up with Stephanie and Joshua Gardner, who's going to be terrific. And then there's also a session on Brahms Sonata in E-flat, which is Young Artist Competition, which Tom Piercy is presenting. He's actually here with us today. So I recommend you check those out. Social media pushes will be taking place on Facebook and Instagram. Alessandra, you can look me up on Facebook. That's one option. Another is, this is my professional website, which will get you to all of my social media stuff. And that's probably actually the best resource. I'm just starting to learn, like, I'm like a reluctant social media user. Like, I'm just starting to figure out how Instagram works. Because everyone's like, oh, students, they hang out, the college students, prospective college students, they look at Instagram a lot. So I was like, so I suppose I should figure out how to use that. So I'm just starting. But I've been on Facebook for a while. But that's my personal website. I do have a YouTube channel too. But thank you so much for joining us today, and don't hesitate to reach out to me. I do love questions, and I love talking about all things clarinet.